please, I would be more than interested in hearing thoughts, questions, comments, suggestions as we go through it. All right, together we bring the truth to light. Like I said, my name is Clent Holmes. Actually not originally from Longview. I was born and raised in Terrell, Texas. I've been here for about 13 years. I'm married, I have 3 girls, and I've served in numerous capacities, let's just say that, since I've been here. But I think most consistently, disciple and mentor are probably what I'm most consistent in. So what brought me to East Texas was actually my practice in mechanical engineering. I went to Lamar University, graduated in 2007, came straight to East Texas, worked in the engineering field for Lumen, Martin Lake Power Plant, Tatum. Worked in the engineering field for about 10 years. In that time, I started to kind of work on the side as a trainer, which is kind of the bridge that got me to focusing on teens and youth. Right now, I serve as director for a teen development program called Thrive here in Longview. And then really today I'm standing here in the capacity of project coordinator for the team, the organization, the group that I mentioned earlier, the 1919 Longview Remembrance Project. So this is what I would like to do. As we have this conversation, I'd like to first take a step back in history. I think in order for us to have an honest conversation and a complete conversation really about what took place in Longview, I think it helps to understand what was going on nationally and also what took place leading up to 1919. So we'll do that, and then after that we'll have a conversation really just kind of using our imaginations. Like, if I was here, if I was this particular individual, if I witnessed, if I saw, if I heard, how would I respond? It's simple. It's easy looking back to say, oh man, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have said that. That wouldn't have been me. But it's easy to do that because we're removed from the situation. And so one of the things that I've learned as of recent, really learning to appreciate history, I'm learning how to put myself in the story. And that has made all the difference for me when I engage history. When I can see it from the perspective, or at least try to, of the individuals involved, it really makes a difference with how I receive it and how I interpret it. So if we take a step back, we'll start post-emancipation, or just as slavery as we know it was coming to an end. So you have the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but if you're familiar with Texas history, we actually were still practicing slavery. It was 2.5 years before the enslaved in Texas earned or got their freedom. It was June 19th when the word finally got to Texas. So just think about that. 1863, a law, a decree, a mandate is given by the president that, okay, slavery is officially over. But still for 2.5 years, Texas is continuing to practice. And it takes an additional effort to really get things, or get the word here, here in Texas. 5 years later, Longview's founding, which of course we're all aware because we're celebrating our sesquicentennial of 150 years. So again, just putting things in context. Slavery ends, Longview's founding, we're in Texas. Texas is a little bit rebellious. Later, they finally get on board. 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was significant because this provided, or was supposed to provide, public protection. So public transportation, the right to sit on a jury, the right to be in public restaurants. At least that was the intent, but it didn't quite go over that way. In fact, there was a ruling in 1883 that actually kind of nullified the Civil Acts right of 1875 when the Supreme Court declared this act unconstitutional in civil rights cases in 1883. So again, just trying to give you some context, give you an idea of what's taking place. And then the passage of black codes. So think about a a culture, an environment, a world where all of a sudden slavery comes to an end. And if we're really honest about slavery, slavery was a very powerful economic machine. Slavery was a way that allowed business to thrive because of free labor. So when you cut that off, it presents all kind of issues. It's not just a matter of, okay, yeah, let's free some people and let's go on with life. There are several challenges that present itself as a result. So what's starting to take place as soon as slavery is over is now all of a sudden we have to find a way to make up for that loss in economic productivity. Black codes, and I didn't put a date on it because it really evolved over the years, but black codes were a way of basically still enforcing some of the things that slavery allowed without calling it slavery. So it might look like if we catch a freed or formerly enslaved person who doesn't have papers to show, they are required or they lose income for that year and are required to pay it back or be indebted, which leads us to what's coming up here in a second with sharecropping. Sharecropping late in the 1880s was really at a height and really saw its prominence, again, thinking of evolution since slavery. Slavery is illegal, but there still needs to be a way to recoup what was lost economically. And then you have 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. This was when the Supreme Court made a decision and upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. The case stemmed from an 1882 incident in which African-American train passenger Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car for blacks. This was because they had separate seating for blacks and whites. Rejecting his argument that his constitutional rights were violated, the Supreme Court ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks was not unconstitutional. So this was the ruling that again furthered the oppression. And so now we're getting into the Jim Crow era. Now we're starting to see legalized ways of discrimination, legalized ways of oppression. And so again, as we push closer and closer to 1919, I just want to draw a picture for you to understand where we were in society. Then we get to 1910. Interestingly enough, in 1910, Gregg County's black population was between 48 and 50%, compared to now where it's 22 to 23%. That's significant. Keeping in mind, slavery just ended. In order for slavery to be successful, there was a system of always, honestly, breeding to ensure that the economic aspects of slavery was continuing to thrive. And so the numbers were extremely high, but think about that number. 48 to 50% of Gregg County was black at that time. And then we fast forward a little bit to 1915, The Birth of a Nation. This was a film, a blockbuster film that was very popular, very well known, that really served as it wasn't the origin, but it served as a resurgence for the Ku Klux Klan. This film was screened in the White House during this time to celebrate its success, to celebrate what it meant for that culture in that time. This is 1915, 4 years before we get to 1919, where we're getting ready to discuss. The racist attacks in 1919 were widespread. So we're focusing specifically on Longview, but you'll see here in a second, this was taking place all across the nation. and often indiscriminate, but in many places they were initiated by white servicemen and centered upon the 380,000 black veterans who had just returned from World War I, November of 1918. Because of their military service, black veterans were seen as a particular threat to Jim Crow and racial subordination. And I've taken this from the Equal Justice Initiative. Okay, so this is a map. This just basically shows you where a lot of, or at least the most well-known racial riots and incidents that took place across the country. This shows 24 incidents. That wasn't the entirety of them. These were just, again, the ones that were most notable. You'll see in Texas, Longview, you'll see Port Arthur, Texas, and Southeast, and then you'll also see Texarkana. Granted, some of these were much worse than what we experienced here in Longview. Okay, so timeline of events. Let's talk about the specific events that took place that led to what we now know as the Longview Race Riot. It really stemmed from an event that took place in Kilgore. We actually have with us today Mr. Mandel Soker, who has written and directed a short film around the relationship of Lemuel Walters and the white lady that he was in relationship with that really kind of sparked what we now know as the Race Riot. So on June 16th, he was arrested and lynched. He was found the next day with bullet holes in his body, basically for the relationship that he was in at that time. As you can imagine, with everything that was going on racially, that just was not tolerated, was not accepted. 11 men from a prominent organization known as the Negro Business League went and, once they found out about it, approached Gregg County Judge Erskine. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Is that right? Erskine. Bramlett. So what's taking place in this gap, June 22nd is when word kind of starts to get out. There's an individual by the name of Samuel L. Jones, also known as a professor, who catches word of what took place on June 16th, when Lemuel Walters was forcibly taken from the prison and then killed. And so word is starting to get out. People are starting to ask questions. Hey, what's going on? Why is this not receiving publicity? Why is this being kept quiet? Also, what's taking place right before what I'm about to mention on July 10th is there's an article from the Chicago Defender that surfaces and is starting to make its round in East Texas. There are several black businesses in South Longview that distribute this publication, and so it doesn't take long before the word gets out, which leads us to the incident on July 10th. July 10th, who I mentioned before, the professor, Samuel L. Jones, he's met by three men coming out of a grocery store right in front of the courthouse on Methven Street. They're confronting him about the article because the understanding or belief is that he is the one who wrote the article, but he's just doing it through the Chicago Defender. He denies it, altercation starts, they basically beat him, hit him over the head with a wrench. He manages to get away. And so that's probably the next notable event that further incites what is known as the Race Riot. So he leaves the scene, makes it to a friend of his, another leader in the black community named Dr. Calvin Davis. He makes it to him for medical attention. They later together, both Jones and Davis, approached the Chamber of Commerce secretary trying to, get some support, get some direction. And they're kind of met with the same type of opposition, basically asking, hey, did you write the article or not? So no success there. So that's the second attempt to try to get some law enforcement or some kind of involvement going. So later, Davis goes downtown to see the mayor. This is significant because of both Davis and Jones's leadership position, but also what they represented for the black community at that time. They were well known, they were very involved, and along with their contribution came clout and influence. And so the interesting thing is, as you read through the exchanges, they are in a relationship with a lot of the individuals that they're going to seeking help. So he goes to the mayor. The mayor says, hey, I assure you we'll check into it. Just keep it quiet. Let's figure out what's going on. Later on that night, the mayor sends a message to Jones and Davis, basically saying, hey, you might want to get out of town. Some stuff is starting to pick up. I would heavily advise you get out of town. Now, pause there for a second, because this is one, at least in my imagination, this is one of the most pivotal moments in what's about to take place. Putting yourselves in their shoes, why wouldn't you just get out of town? Why wouldn't you comply knowing what's potentially about to take place? So there was a lynching back in June that stayed under the radar for the most part, didn't get a lot of notoriety, didn't get much publication. You've already had a friend assaulted with a wrench, beaten up, which I'm assuming was broad daylight, because it was stated to be during the day in front of the courthouse. So these things are already starting to pick up and take steam. So putting yourselves in their mind, why would you stay? Why wouldn't you comply and leave? And so as I started to think about that question, I read that said Jones, the educator, he was in his early 30s. I'm 36. My mom is 72. If I'm in his position, more than likely she was a part of slavery. In fact, at least the way my math is working out, she would have been pregnant with me as emancipation was taking place, specifically in Texas, because there was another 2.5 years. So I probably have very vivid stories, experiences that have been passed on, that have been shared, that I've heard, that have really started to sit and sink in my mind in terms of what this means in the broader context of what's going on. So yeah, I could comply. I could take my family. They had families. I could take my families. I'm thinking about my 6-year-old. How am I going to protect her if I decide to make this stand? What does this mean for my 10-year-old who may have to witness her dad being killed? So I would imagine all of these things are going through their mind as they're deciding what to do next. So, I'm going to read an excerpt. One of the books that I brought with me was The Red Summer, which I just simply checked out from the library. But it recounts several locations all over the nation where these events took place, and it has a very good, thorough chapter on Longview. So I'm going to read an excerpt here in a second. So that night, of course, the mayor has already sent word suggesting they get out of town. He's starting to see things are starting to get heated. So he calls an emergency meeting at City Hall. This meeting is with white leaders only. Some of the names that were listed: Chief of Police Sam Matthews, and then Tom Flanagan. Davis, the physician, finds out about the meeting, and he decides he's going. Gets his pistol, gets together, and literally just barges into the meeting because he's wanting answers. He's wanting to see what's going on. And I'm going to read that account. All right, so he enters, and he's told to take off his hat, as he was ordered, a customary act of deference to whites. For maybe the first time in his life, the 34-year-old Davis told the gathered white men, many of whom he knew on a first-name basis, that he would not. Yes, that's all you all say to a colored man who comes to talk serious business to you. Take off your hat, Davis said. I am not going to do it. I want to know what protection we colored citizens are going to have tonight. So this is him going to the City Hall meeting of white leaders to confront and demand for justice. And so that evening, later that evening, around approximately 11 o'clock, that kind of bleeds over into the next day, that's when what I'm calling or referring to as the stand takes place. So that's basically a standoff, a shoot-off between black citizens that were at Jones's house, basically as his protection, and a white mob that came to confront them. So as the word starts to get out about what's about to take place, these men basically decide, and it's not just the two I'm talking about. At this point, it's up to, I believe, 25, and they all say, listen, we're not dealing with this. We're not leaving. We've tried. We've called for help. We've gone and talked to officials. We're not getting the help that we need. We're not leaving. As dusk gathered, the men in Jones's yard set up defensive positions in and around the small clapboard house. Jones was sent to a relative's house to hide. The men waited. Around 11 p.m., Davis sneaked into town and saw armed white men gathering at the fire department. He rushed back to Jones's house, telling the men to flee if they wanted. All stayed. Around midnight, the group of about 12 to 15 armed whites made their way to Bodie Park next to the railroad that divided the city. Within an hour, the mob made its way to Jones's front yard. Davis saw Tom Flanagan was a mob leader. The white men shouted for Jones to come out. No one answered. When the mob tried to force its way into the house, the black men waiting in ambush opened fire. Davis claims to have fired the first shot. So this is what I'm referring to as the stand, the first major altercation of the riot, where you have shots being fired. Nobody in that stand lost their life, but there was, I forget the gentleman's name. There was a white man who later died of injuries. So you have the altercation takes place. Basically, those who are defending the house, they basically win that feud at that time. The white mob flees, gets the wounded, gets away from the scene, and they basically call for help. When news of the shootout reached the mayor, he sent off 2 telegrams to the Chicago Defender asking who wrote the article, which I thought was kind of interesting. Here you are now, shootout has taken place, lives are at stake, bullets are flying, not yet, but things are about to start being destroyed and burned down, and he's seeking to find out who wrote the article. Kind of interesting. He stressed he needed an immediate response as black lives were at stake. Bodie seemed ready to resolve the trouble by offering up to the mob the sole author of the article. And again, this altercation is behind the assumption that Jones, the educator, that he wrote the article. All right, so what happens next? They sound an alarm. Literally, there's a fire alarm that is sounded, and it's reported that up to 1,000 white men descend on downtown Longview in retaliation for what just took place at what I'm calling the stand. Friday, that morning, the 11th, white men broke into Welch Hardware near the square, taking guns, ammunition, and then 4 a.m., they rally up and they go back to finish what they started. And so at this point, they get back to Jones's house. Of course, they're not there. They fled. They've all gone to different destinations. And so this is when they begin to basically burn, destroy. Somewhere between 8 and 10 businesses. You have Jones's house is destroyed. Davis's business, the doctor, his business is destroyed. There's a quick haul, the Negro Business League building is destroyed. At one point, they were going to destroy physician Davis's house, and one of the neighbors stops him long enough to let his family get out. And so at this point, everything is just kind of all over the place. So this map shows you kind of the major points of activity. And again, using our imagination, this is in proximity very close to where we are now. Right down Medford Street, again, is where everything, at least where the altercation started. But the red star is where we are now. The arrow at the top yellow pointing to the one, I don't know if you can see it, that's the site where the altercation from the grocery store or in front of the courthouse. took place where the three men assaulted Jones. This other arrow on the top left corner, number 10, that's Bush's house. Bush is the father-in-law of Davis, the physician. His name's gonna come up here in a second. Number 3, right here in the middle, that is Jones's house. That's actually where the standoff took place, to where the mob returned later and burned the home down. And then number 6, the bottom left corner, that's Dr. Davis's house. I've actually gone and kind of driven this path, again, just to kind of imagine, see, you know, of course things were different then, but just to kind of feel, imagine, understand the proximity, you know, where these things took place, what happened, who did what. All right, so at this point, they're destroying different businesses, homes, and places in South Longview. Several members have fled. Fortunately, unfortunately, I guess when you look at it, there were not a lot of fatalities, but there is one that's coming up. They managed, they being Davis and Jones, the two prominent leaders of this movement, they managed to get away. They managed to get out of town. They actually both went to Chicago after this, and that's where they resided. But they managed to sneak out and get away. It was very creative the way they did it. So at this point, Texas Rangers and state militia are patrolling the streets. The mayor has called the governor. At this point, things are frantic. They're concerned about the potential of what this could become, because again, this is taking place across the nation. This is not just an isolated incident in Longview. On Saturday, the Gregg County Sheriff and another man went to the home of Marion Bush. Marion Bush, again, is the father-in-law of Dr. Davis. I've since found some documents that says he may have been involved in the riot as far as the altercation. They went to his home reportedly to offer protection. But again, thinking about the context, what's taking place, he doesn't trust that's actually what they're doing. So he flees. Shots are fired, he gets away, and then he's found later dead shot to death in a cornfield, killed by a white farmer is the way it reads. And so by Sunday, the 13th, Governor William Hobby has imposed martial law. So that's curfew, everybody turned guns in, they actually were kept here at the courthouse. And that martial law was lifted later on the 18th. Eventually, 26 white men were arrested and freed on bond. 21 black men were arrested and charged of attempted murder and taken to Austin jail, again, for their protection, and all were released without trial. So again, that's just to kind of paint the picture and give you an idea of what was going on in and around the events that we know as the Race Riot. The national tragedy of Red Summer, again, numerous locations around the country. This was an intense period for race relations, and unfortunately, these racially motivated terrorist attacks set the country back. This was a couple of decades after Reconstruction, a period that realized a significant improvement in the social, economic, and political contributions of the black community. I failed to mention that earlier. One of the things that is really significant about what's taking place nationally, so if you can imagine what type of mindset it takes to enslave human beings, there wasn't a widespread belief that black people were capable of being civilized. There was not a widespread belief that if they were given these freedoms, that they would behave, they would be civil, they would be productive, because they weren't intelligent enough, they were too, just fill in the blank. So, after emancipation, and what I refer to when I say Reconstruction, this is the time frame where they're starting to get agency, they're starting to get some rights, they're starting to establish themselves and create a real opportunity at citizenship, at dignity. And given that time and given those protections, that was a huge part of it, there were federal troops that were in the South to ensure that they would be protected as they're trying to have a normal life. Well, they started to flourish. If you look at history, you'll see back in the 1870s, 1880s, you'll see the first black congressman, the first black, and they used to always confuse me in school because you would see those dates and then you see this huge gap, literally 100 years. I'm like, how does that happen? Well, as they started to thrive, as they started to run their own businesses, establish their own communities, that started to create tension. And so what ended Reconstruction was basically a lack of commitment to their citizenship, to their dignity, humanity, and they did not provide those troops to protect them anymore. And that's when you have racialized terror running rapid. That's when you don't have the protection of the government, of law enforcement. And that's when things like Ku Klux Klan is just literally running through the South, having its way. And later on, after the 1919, actually during the riot, you have what's known as the Great Migration, where somewhere around 6 million blacks leave the South. And a lot of it is because of the racialized terror. A lot of it is because of all of the oppression and things that they're running into just trying to establish normalcy. A period that was seeing a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Remember the Birth of a Nation screening that kind of reinvigorated the Ku Klux Klan. Less than a year after black troops were returning from fighting in World War I, there was a lot of fear or anticipation that because several black soldiers were coming back, that now they would have this sense of, I don't know, entitlement or whatever. And so there were a lot of murmuring about potential uprisings, which most of the time did not prove to be true, as if like individuals in the black community were planning to execute a rebellion of some sort. In fact, when they came to do martial law here in Longview, one of the first things they did is they started going through searching for this, and they couldn't find anything. When really what the black community was doing is just banding together and unifying in order to have a chance of a normal life. So several months of unease and rumors were being circulated of black communities planning revolts. So I mentioned earlier that there was a team of individuals who we banded together so that we could bring light to the events of the 1919 Race Riot, tell the story in truth, tell what actually happened, because there are way too many instances where people here in Longview, been here their entire lives, don't know about this occurrence. That's not coincidence. It's not taught, it's not practiced, it's not